Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this live stream. My name is Dwayne Klein, and I am the pastor of Houston Street Baptist Church in downtown Hamilton, Ontario. I'm excited to host this evening on behalf of Noetic Shift, which is a partnership of churches that exists to thoughtfully and respectfully engage the culture of the greater Hamilton area from a distinctly Christian perspective and worldview. Noetic has to do with the mind or the intellect, and so a Noetic shift involves a shift in the mind or a shift or change of mind or intellect. We want to create safe settings where people from a variety of perspectives are free to come and discuss important life-altering issues, assumptions, and realities of our world. Things such as origin, meaning, hope, and identity. As we all know, the world has faced a serious pandemic at the moment. And as relational beings, we've all been forced to social distance as the coronavirus has significantly impacted our economy and changed how everyone lives our daily lives. This deserves some thought and some discussion around where is God in all of this. And so Noetic Shift has been excited to partner in this series with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, an organization who, by, quote, helping the thinker believe and the believer think, end quote, is accomplishing globally what we're trying to do locally. RZIM is a global team of speakers whose primary mission is to reach and challenge those who shape the ideas of a culture and with the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Tonight's topic is life in the marketplace post-pandemic. It's an exciting topic that I'm thrilled to be a part of and to listen to, as my wife and I happen to own a storefront here in Hamilton. And so this has affected us with employees and merchandise greatly. And so I look forward to hearing what our speaker has to say. We're delighted tonight to have Max Jeganathan with us this evening. Max is the Asia Pacific Regional Director of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. He leads a team of pioneering apologist evangelists. He speaks around Asia on how the Christian faith answers the deepest questions of life. Max has spoken in banks, universities, government, and political institutions, as well as in debates and at churches and conferences. He is passionate about the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ to transform lives. He was born in Sri Lanka, and his family moved to Australia as refugees in the mid-1980s. He has worked as a lawyer and a political and policy advisor in the Australian National Parliament, including time as an advisor to a senior cabinet minister and as senior social policy advisor to the leader of the Australian opposition. Max was educated at the Australian National University and the University of Oxford. He lives in Singapore with his wife Fiona and their two young children. Max, we're delighted that you've joined us tonight, so thank you for being here. And as I turn this over to you, I'd like to mention to those of you that are watching that we invite you to bring your questions. You'll see there's a portion at the bottom of your screen that says ask a question. Write them out, and Max will take time to answer as many questions as he can at the end. But now let me turn this over to you, Max, to address this challenging topic, life in the marketplace post-pandemic.
Well, thank you so much, Dwayne, for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure for us at RZIM to be partnering with you guys at Noetic Shift, and this series is just a real wonderful thing for us to be teaming up on. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Happy belated Canada Day to all of you. I know we're a couple of days on. It's a good morning here from Singapore, actually. I'm sitting here at my flat in Singapore. It is Friday morning. I know it's Thursday evening for you, but it's great to be with you. This isn't part of my talk, but I also really need to say this. It's my first opportunity as a speaker to just congratulate those of you who are fans on the Toronto Raptors championship last year. I haven't had a chance to speak to Canadians since then. And I've got a lot of cousins that live in Canada, all over Canada. Some of them are actually tuning in, I think. So I just had to get that out for the Raptors. Look, as Dwayne correctly said, it's a time of uncertainty. It's a time of a lot of trepidation, some suffering. It's manifesting in many different ways: economic, financial, emotional, psychological, and of course, medical and physical too. This pandemic is having probably a combined greater impact in a medical sense than the Spanish flu at the beginning of the last century, a greater sociological and cultural impact than 9/11, certainly a greater economic impact than the global financial crisis of 2008, arguably when it plays out, a greater economic and financial impact than the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression that followed. So this is really bringing together a lot of the struggles and the intrinsic uncertainty in our systems. And they apply to the marketplace in two different ways. And so there are really two different marketplaces that are impacted by this pandemic. There is the marketplace in a real sense. There's the Main Street, Wall Street marketplace, the real economy, our businesses, our jobs, our schools, our travel, what's happening out there. And then there is the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace that occurs up here, and probably more importantly, in here. How we understand the bigger, deeper questions of life and how this pandemic brings to light some of the things that are really in that marketplace. And everything I say to you today relates to both marketplaces, the marketplace of ideas and the real marketplace out there in the world. And in whatever capacity you take your role in that world, whether it's as an employee, a student, someone who's searching for work, a business owner, a small business owner, a senior executive, a politician, a leader, a church leader, whatever it might be. We all are involved and engaged in these two marketplaces, the marketplace out there and the marketplace in here. As Dwayne said, I started my professional life as a lawyer. I was admitted to the bar and I practiced law for a few years in Australia. And then I worked as a political advisor in the Australian Parliament. I had the pleasure of working for a couple of prime ministers, for a senior cabinet minister, for a leader of the opposition there. And in that time, my friends and I got hooked on The West Wing. As most of you will know, political drama, fictional White House, created by whom I consider to be one of the great television writers of all time, Aaron Sorkin. And he invented this fictional United States president, Josiah Bartlet. And in inventing this character, he actually squashed together about 12 or 13 historical US presidents. And one thing that Sorkin took from John F. Kennedy was a little plaque that JFK had on his desk in the Oval Office. And that plaque was on Josiah Bartlet's desk in every episode of The West Wing, and you would see it almost every episode. And as a young political advisor, I was writing speeches, I was doing, economic forecasts and, advising this government. I was pretty fresh, out of the law, still very, very wet behind the ears, but I used to draw a lot of kind of energy and inspiration from The West Wing. And so this quote really went into my head, and the quote on JFK's desk said this: "The sea is so big, but my boat is so small. The sea is so big, but my boat is so small." And at times like this pandemic has made us all feel like that in some way, that the sea is so big out there and our boat seems so small. We seem to have such little control. There seems to be so much chaos and uncertainty. The recent specter of kind of rising racial tensions all over the world has added to that. The economic uncertainty has added to that. The geopolitical uncertainty, for so many reasons, has added to that. And so it's always been the case that the sea seems big and we seem small on some level. But now, perhaps more than ever, at least in living memory, the sea does seem so big and our boats seem so small. Even just in Canada, as I know most of you are tuning in from, the unemployment rate there sits at somewhere around 14%. It went from 5 or 6% up to 14% just between February and April. That is unprecedented. Here in Singapore, this is not the country of my birth or my citizenship, but I've been here for a few years, and Singapore prides itself on its economic security. We have 2 sovereign wealth funds that are in the top 11 on the planet. We have some of the best economic, educational infrastructure on the planet. And Singapore is going through an economic contraction that's likely to be somewhere between 7 and 10% this year. That's the highest in Singapore's history. Unemployment in the United States is likely to go up by a scale factor of 1 or 2, even from where it is now. Australia, which is the country where I'm from, we were talked about as this miracle economy for business. And we had this bull run with no economic recessions for 29 years. And that ended, well, it's about to end in this financial quarter, where Australia is going into its first recession. We see it in the hearts and minds of people, in the homes of people, the impact of this pandemic. Suicide rates are up. Sexual aggression is up. Domestic violence is up. The best data that we have suggests that For every percentage point that unemployment rises in any given country, suicide rates roughly as a percentage rise by that same amount. So unemployment and suicide rates are rising at the same time. So it's quite likely that the mental and emotional health impacts of this pandemic have not hit their worst yet. So we see through all of these indicators, whether economic, social, financial, psychological, that our boat seems so small and the sea does seem so big. How are we going to navigate this? How are we going to take our next steps as we come, hopefully, to the back end, at least, of the medical impacts of this virus? And I do want to say, just by way of disclaimer, that to even suggest that we are moving into a post-COVID world is a very first world thing to say. When you look at countries like India, when you look at sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in South America, the medical impacts of this pandemic are just starting to rise there. So they look a lot like Canada and Singapore and Australia and the United States looked in January, February this year. So even to call it a post-COVID world might be a little bit presumptive. But considering for most of the people on this call, for most of us at least, we've seen the worst of this, at least medically. How are we going to step into this world of uncertainty and this uncertain ocean that we seem to need to be able to navigate through in our tiny, tiny boats? And I want to talk about three things that we are all going to need to learn to do. And on some level, we've all been doing these things always our entire life, but this pandemic has brought the explicit nature of the need for these three things to the surface. And they are the need for each of us, no matter who we are, no matter what we believe in, no matter where we live, each of us in this post-COVID world, to survive this marketplace of ideas and the real marketplace out there, we are going to need to navigate uncertainty, we are going to need to rethink independence, and we are going to need to deal with suffering. We're going to need to navigate uncertainty, rethink independence, and deal with suffering. Now, when we think about this task of navigating uncertainty, which is kind of the overarching challenge that we all have, the navigation of uncertainty has been met by humankind with a very instinctive and common response over many thousands of years. When we come across uncertainty, what we like to do, when we come across the storm, right? We talk about the sea being big and our boats being small. When we come across the storm, we like to be able to control the storm or predict the storm. That's the human instinct, and that's the message of the marketplace out there. Yes, there's uncertainty, but we need to find a way to control it, or we need to find a way to predict what's going to happen so that we can navigate it. And when we look at, really credible publications like The Economist and The Atlantic, and where there's lots of economic theorists and trend theorists and so forth, they do the best they can to forecast what is going to happen. And so, no matter whether we're in business or we're just living our lives as students or in our families, we try to work out as best we can what's going to happen so we can navigate the uncertainty through these predictive models, through these forecasts, if you like, just like the weather forecast that we get every day. George Ritzer was an American sociologist, and he kind of summed this up in a term in the 1900s, which he called McDonaldization. And he coined the term in the 50s and 60s when the McDonald's fast food joint was taking off. But he really broke this idea of McDonaldization down to four sociological things that affect all people and certainly shape modern society as we know it. He said, in modern society, we are always trying to do four things in the storm. We are trying to strive for efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. Efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control, which really reflects this human instinct to want to control and predict and understand the outcomes. Here in Asia, where I'm currently living, it's exactly the same, possibly more so. We're probably more quantitatively driven here by models and algorithms and that kind of forecasting. It's all very, very quantitative. When we look at the systems and institutions on which we've built modern society globally, it's all about predictive models and predictive analysis. We just want to know what's going to happen, right? Whether it's the birth of our kids, whether it's the future revenue impacts for our businesses, whether it's the impact on tithing for those of us who are church leaders or working in churches, whether it's the impact on tithing that this pandemic is going to have. We just want some kind of certainty. Now, the problem with George Ritzer's, well, not the problem with his analysis is spot on, but the problem with our predictions is that what this last 6 months has shown us is that those predictions are always under significant threat to the kind of volatility that things like this pandemic has shown. And this pandemic is just one example. I'm sure all of you have had other kinds of, what the economists and the behavioral psychologists call black swan events in your life. We've all had black swan events, whether it's a death, whether it's a shock medical diagnosis, whether it's a job loss, whether it's betrayal by a friend, or whether it's a broken relationship, whether it's a crime that you've been the victim of. These are all black swan events. And black swan events, it's just a metaphor that's used by the economists. It basically refers to an event that defies the models. It defies our forecasts. So we think something's going to pan out in a certain way, and then there is a black swan event that just kind of comes out of nowhere. There's a great book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb about it that talks about it in an economic and financial sense. But the black swan event can happen anywhere. Now, the reason that we call that the metaphor is named black swan is because where most of the classical economic and sociological thinking was done was in parts of the world, the North Atlantic, the United States, the United Kingdom, parts of continental Europe, where swans by and large are white. Now, here's a funny thing. I grew up in a city in Australia called Perth. And in Perth, there are just tons and tons of swans. In fact, we have a river that's called the Swan River because of the number of swans that are around. But all of the swans in Perth are black. All of our swans are black. And so growing up in Perth, I just assumed that all swans were black. And it wasn't until I think I was on a holiday in England visiting some of my cousins where I first saw a white swan, which was very confusing for me because the rest of, at least the scholarly world, is always operating on the assumption that black swans are the unusual things. But interestingly enough, in this last 6 months, perhaps in this last 15 years, you could even make the argument, 20, 21 years that it started with 9/11, that there has just been black swan after black swan after black swan, whether it's economic shocks, whether it's trade shocks, whether it's psychological shocks and mental ill health shocks, and now this pandemic. We seem to be in a world that's much more like Perth than it is the North Atlantic. There seems to be far more black swans than white swans. And you can make the case now that we might as well just accept that almost every swan is black. Now, what does that tell us about our predictive models? It means that there's nothing wrong with predicting things. There's nothing wrong with having forecasts. And in fact, particularly if you're in arenas of leadership, it makes sense for you to be reading around about what the experts think is going to happen. Because more often than not, what our predictive models tell us about what's going to happen has some reasonable confluence with what actually happens. So even, if you're a student and you're trying to plan what to enroll in next or whether to go to campus or not, it's worth noting what your university says is going to happen. Those predictions are important. So I'm not saying that we need to abandon predictive models, but this pandemic has given us cause for re-understanding our predictions, all the way from weather forecasting to planning holidays with our friends to planning weddings with our families. And it's because of this very simple reality that any good economist or financial modeler will tell you. All of our predictions are based on data sets that are necessarily from the past. So all prediction is based on the past. Even our weather forecasting, we base it on atmospheric and geographic systems that are based on observations from the past. And then we predict based on all of that past data, what's going to happen in the future. So all prediction is based on the past. And the only problem with the past is, as a data set, it doesn't include the future. So when we look at our need to navigate the uncertainty, it needs to begin with the humility for us to accept that we just don't know what's going to happen. It doesn't matter how much we try to control the storm or try and predict the storm. There are aspects of the storm that we are just not going to be able to control, nor are we able to predict. And in that, we see a very, very clear takeout for us in how we can go about navigating the uncertainty of the storms, not just of the present, but of the future post-COVID world, when, God willing, it will come quickly. And that lesson is this, that we need to stop trying to control and predict the storm. And what we need to do is find an anchor outside of the storm. We need to stop controlling and predicting it, and we need to find an anchor outside of that storm. And this conceptually is very, very simple when we use the analogy of an anchor, because that's exactly how anchors operate. They don't work unless they are attached to something outside of the storm. It doesn't matter how good your anchor is. It doesn't matter how strong it is, what it's made of, what it can tell you, if there's a computer embedded in the anchor. It doesn't really matter. Unless the anchor is attached to something outside the storm, the sophistication, and the strength, and the utility of your anchor is completely negated. It's completely useless unless it's attached. So the first lesson we can take in navigating uncertainty is that we need to understand that some of the storms that are coming, including the one we are in, cannot be predicted and cannot be controlled. What we need is an anchor outside of the storm. So we need to navigate that instability with an anchor outside of the storm. Secondly, we need to rethink independence. Now, the message from the world out there, the message from the marketplace, at least to date, has been that it's all about self-sufficiency. We need to just build ourselves up. We need to study well. We need to apply ourselves. We need to get financially secure. We need to diversify our investments. We need to, if you're a business leader, we need to shore up our supply chains. If you're a church leader, we need to get the right programs in place, the right people on staff, the right elders, the right people stacking chairs. If you're a student, we need to get into the right courses. We need to build the right kinds of friendships, get in the right study groups. If you're a parent, you need to get the right college funds happening. You need to invest properly for your family. You need to buy that extra house. You need to buy that extra can of beans or that extra bag of rice when the country is going into lockdown. It's all about self-sufficiency. And there's a movie that's a little bit old now called The Martian with Matt Damon in it, which is it's a great movie, but it tells this, it's a fictional story, of course, of an astronaut who is stranded on Mars during man's first mission to Mars. And he's in this ridiculous situation where he has to keep himself alive and make contact with NASA headquarters and somehow get himself back. And the whole spirit of the movie, the message that runs through the entire narrative arc of the movie, is that this guy is just amazing, and human science and innovation and engineering and industriousness is amazing. And so the whole movie is about self-sufficiency. It's about how he keeps himself alive, how he grows his own food, he regenerates his oxygen supply, he makes contact with NASA headquarters, and eventually he does come home. Sorry to spoil it, but you're not going to cast Matt Damon and kill him off during the movie. So he makes it home. But interestingly, the last line of the movie is this character whose name is Mike Watney, played by Matt Damon. He's now a lecturer at the NASA Academy. And what he says to his students is, you have to apply yourself here because you're going to get out there. And of course, he's referring to space in both a literal and a logical sense. He says, and when you get out there, you're going to be presented with a problem. And if you solve that problem, you're going to be presented with another problem. And if you solve that problem, you're going to be presented with another problem. And he goes on and on like this. And then the final line of the movie, he says this: if you solve enough problems, you get to go home. If you solve enough problems, you get to go home. That's exactly what the world is telling us about independence. It's telling us that we need to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps, and then we get to go home. We get peace, we get rest, we get satisfaction, we get what everyone is looking for: fulfillment and flourishing, that sense of satisfaction with life, happiness. Some people reduce it to happiness, but it's more than that. It's fulfillment, right? It's that sense that we are doing what we are here to do. But the message of the world, as was the message in that movie, is that it's up to you to apply yourself to do that. Now, what this pandemic has shown us is that when we think about independence, all of the systems and institutions on which we build our striving for independence, including our own efforts, ultimately, because of these black swans, because of the intrinsic volatility in these systems, because of the intrinsic volatility in the world, they all come crashing down sooner or later. They all come crashing down sooner or later. And we have seen in this last 6 months, and many of us have seen it before that, how the myth of independence has been proven to be illogical and failing us both practically and philosophically. It's failed us practically in the last 6 months alone, because literally all our huge systems have come crashing down. Our economic and financial systems, our systems of international and even domestic travel and geographic people movements, our systems of finance. We saw the end to the bull run that started with the global financial crisis, and now markets, which seem to be strangely okay, but if you talk to financial analysts, they'll say they're pretty much on life support. There's a very thin veneer of security in the financial and equities markets. So all of these systems, all it took was a virus, right? It took something that we couldn't predict, that we could prepare for, but we couldn't predict it, we couldn't control it. And yet the myth of self-sufficiency and independence that we built for ourselves brought all of these systems to a grinding, crashing halt. Even our capacity, right, at the heart of this crisis, to just go out and have a coffee with our friends was brought to a grinding halt. Self-sufficiency is has been shown to be practically flawed. It's also shown itself to be philosophically flawed, and it's quite simple. If anyone tells you that they are independent, and we all want to be independent, right? We want to raise kids who are independent. We want to be strong. We relate independence to resilience and strength. And similarly, we relate dependence to negativity. We relate it to weakness and struggle and need, and we don't like that. We don't want to be dependent. And yet, when we look at it philosophically and in our own hearts, we are all dependent on something. To the person who says, I am financially independent, and they draw that sense of satisfaction from their financial independence, it just means that they're dependent on the ideal of financial independence. Anyone who tells you, and it might be you, who's very proud of being emotionally independent, and you draw your identity from that, it just means that you're dependent on the ideal of emotional independence. As soon as something happens to threaten that, then your entire independence is shown to be very thin. Not that it's not real, but it's just very thin. We can't build our identity on our self-sufficiency. We can't build our identity on our independence. This is not a call to laziness in a post-COVID world. This is a call for us to do everything we can, to plan the best we can, to prepare ourselves the best we can, to apply ourselves the best we can, and then to understand that we are still deeply dependent on something or another. And all of the systems that we've built on which we live, cultural, political, economic, financial systems, they are all heavily dependent on other people and other things that are out of our control. If this virus had hit in the 13 or 1400s, it wouldn't have traveled more than a couple of hundred miles. You know, it's our systems of international travel and geography, the integration of our economic systems since the Second World War that allowed this thing to spread the way it spread. So we have built integrated systems that have made us more dependent on each other necessarily in so many ways. So what we see when we look at what the world is telling us about just being more independent, you know, that Dylan Thomas line, rage against the dying of the light, just stand up, be strong, strengthen up, double down on your work ethic and just apply yourself more, and you can innovate your way out of the problem or think your way or engineer your way like Matt Damon did in The Martian. What we see is the clearer reality, the more correct statement is not that we need to become more self-sufficient, it's that we need to acknowledge our lack of self-sufficiency and find something dependable on which to place our unavoidable dependence. The world says become more independent. The truth is we need to find something worthy of our dependence. And it's amazing and amusing that at the end of that movie, even when they are fictionally trying to build a narrative of human independence and self-sufficiency, he's not independent at all. He ends up getting rescued. That's how he gets back to Earth. They have to come and rescue him. He's completely dependent in the end, and his dependence is shown forth at the end of that movie. So we see that independence is not about not needing anything. Independence of mind and thought is about having the courage to understand that we are actually dependent and using our independent freedoms to choose the right thing on which to place our dependence. So in navigating instability, we need to choose the right thing to find an anchor outside of the storm. And in rethinking independence, we need to choose the right object on which to place our dependence. Thirdly and finally, we need to deal with suffering. Suffering is ubiquitous. Suffering is something we all go through. It's intrinsic to this pandemic, and it's going to be a part of life today, tomorrow, and into the future in this post-COVID world, in both marketplaces, the marketplace out there and the marketplace in here. The world around us gives us another message here. It's given us two incorrect messages. On instability and on independence, it gave incorrect messages, and it gives an incorrect message on suffering, because the world will tell us to avoid suffering. Now, in and of itself, that's not a problem. I'm not advising anyone to go and just start walking into doors and walking into traffic just because that will cause more suffering. But I'm saying that avoiding suffering, once again, misunderstands the nature of the human heart and misunderstands the nature of the world out there. There's a great novel called Gilead by an author called Marilyn Robinson. She won a Pulitzer Prize for that novel. And in that story, she writes an amazing line. She says, there are two realities that plague all of creation: my insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. My insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. What she's basically saying is that no matter how well I do, or no matter how good my life is, there's always something inside me through which I know that I'm not quite as I should be. I'm not quite perfect. There's always an imperfection inside me that I always am aware of. And it doesn't matter how good the world is out there or how much I try to make it better, there's always something not quite right about the world. There's always something broken about me, and there's always something broken about the world. And from those two realities, and you don't need to be a Christian to accept those two realities. You can just look at the data set out there and the data set in here. From those two realities, we see that we cannot avoid suffering. Suffering is real. Suffering affects everyone. The only question is, how do we deal with suffering? And suffering is going to be a part of a post-COVID world, just like it was a part of a pre-COVID world. But this gives us good pause for thought to reflect on how we can better understand it and better deal with it. And to their credit, all of the other worldviews out there do have a response to suffering. And so I want to just run through very quickly what they are. Religious and irreligious worldviews. There's one category of worldview which tells you that God exists, but he doesn't care about your suffering. He owes you nothing morally. There's no moral obligation or relational connection between you and God. And so your suffering, you just have to shut up and take it. You just have to shut up and take it. Now, that's a worldview that my visa in Singapore, being here, I'm actually not even allowed to mention. But it's held across the Middle East and in large numbers across parts of North Africa and of Indonesia. And you know what I'm talking about. There's another category of worldview, the pantheistic worldviews, that tell you that suffering is just an illusion. It's because you desire too much. That's why you're suffering. You've got to meditate yourself to a point of nothingness, of some kind of consciouslessness, or a complete absence of yourself, where there's no more conscience, where there's no more consciousness, where your consciousness is completely taken away, some kind of nirvana. And so when you do that, you won't feel any more suffering. There's another category of worldviews, the karmic worldviews, and they will tell you that suffering is your fault. Anyone who's suffering as a result of this pandemic and otherwise is suffering because of something that they have done, either in this life or in a previous life. And that's why they're suffering. And then we get to the atheistic worldviews, of which there are several, kind of subcategories, obviously. And I'm being overly simplistic, but the atheistic worldviews, which, if they are being honest, will tell you that suffering is meaningless, that all your suffering, because life is meaningless, we are nothing but time plus matter plus chance. And so all your suffering, by definition, is meaningless. And you just have to get over it. On some level, all of these categories of worldviews are telling you that you've just got to get over it. You've just got to deal with it. You've just got to shut up and take it. There's always this element of trying to avoid it. They'll give you some theories of how to avoid it and what you can do. But whatever ends up happening, you've just got to deal with it and get over it. Now, when we look at the world and we look at the reality of the storms and the suffering that is caused by these storms and the instability through which we are guaranteed to have more of these storms in a post-COVID world, we see that we are not really in need of theories or systems of worldviews that tell us how to try and avoid some of the suffering, or just to strengthen up and shut up and get over our suffering, or to just attribute the causes of our suffering to ourselves. Certainly that it's not meaningless. But what we are actually in need of are two things: a sense of comfort and strength in the suffering now so we can get through the storm, and a hope of no more storm, a hope of a world or a life beyond the suffering. We're looking for comfort and strength inside of the suffering, and we're looking for a hope of no more suffering beyond the storm that we are in. So we've looked at what it's the need to navigate instability and what that's like. We've looked at the need to rethink independence and what that's like. And we've looked at the need to deal with suffering. And what we find that we need is an anchor inside the storm. That's how we navigate instability. So we need to find something worthy of our dependence. That's how we rethink independence. And we have to find a way to deal with suffering that engages us in a way that we feel comfort and strength inside the suffering. And then we have a hope for a future beyond the suffering. And then we come to this Christian message, this message of Jesus, this message that we find in the Bible. And we find answers to all of these questions. We find in each of the needs that I've set out a Jesus Christ-shaped hole that fills each of these needs through relationship with evidence. We see that in our need for an anchor outside of the storm, he provides that anchor. He provides a transcendent anchor through which we can anchor our identities, our hope, our sense of who we are, our purpose, our meaning, our future, in a relationship with him. He's outside of the storm. He transcends it. No matter what this pandemic has thrown at you, emotionally, financially, economically, physically, no matter what you've lost, even if you've lost loved ones over this, he can anchor you outside of the storm. He's also shown us through evidence and through the offer of relationship that he's worthy of our dependence. He's objectively worthy of our trust and dependence. Does that mean we can know absolutely everything and every answer to every question? Not necessarily, but we can know more than enough as a basis on which to trust him. He's proved himself eminently dependable and worthy of our independence. He fills that gap that the world leaves us struggling with in its myth of self-sufficiency that it peddles out there. Jesus says, just come to me. I'm offering you relationship based on evidence, various categories of evidence, whatever categories of evidence you want. Wherever your questions are, he's willing to meet you. And then he's willing to manifest that dependency through relationship, the healthiest relationship of dependence that you can possibly have. We are infinitely dependent, as I've explained, and Jesus Christ is eternally dependable. And thirdly and finally, in our need to deal with suffering, this is not a God who says it doesn't matter. He doesn't say he doesn't care. He doesn't say it's meaningless. He doesn't say it's all your fault. He actually steps down into our suffering as a person, goes to a cross, takes all of our suffering onto himself, defeats it and does away with it, so that we can then have comfort and strength in the marketplace to deal with the storms, to deal with the suffering, to deal with the uncertainty now. And then, incredibly, he offers an eternal future with him where there's no more suffering, where the Bible tells us he's going to literally wipe away every tear and all the bad things are going to come undone. They're somehow going to be redeemed and reversed and made good again. There is no other worldview that offers comfort and strength amidst the suffering relationally and an eternal future with the promise of no more suffering at all. It's only through the person of Jesus Christ. This God who suffers, this God who came for you, who wants to reach out to you, who wants to walk more deeply with you. He wants to be in an up-close and personal relationship with you. Now, Dwayne did tip you off to this, and I even started by admitting that I'd worked in politics. But having been a lawyer and a political advisor, my family used to often question my integrity and my honesty. And I was told at one point, well, you've been a lawyer and you've been a political advisor. All you have to do is be a used car salesman and you'll be done in terms of trustworthiness. Everything I've told you tonight is the truth, except for one thing. I did lie to you once during this talk. I told you that the quote on JFK's desk that Sorkin used in The West Wing, I told you that quote said, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." The entire quote is actually not a quote at all. It's a prayer. And it says this: "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." Your sea is so big and my boat is so small. When we look at the COVID world and the post-COVID world and the impact it's going to have on our marketplace out there and our marketplace in here, it makes all the difference in the world to know that this storm in which we're in, we can know the custodian of the storm, the creator of the ocean in which the storm even happens. It's his sea. And more importantly than that, for us, in a personal sense, we can have him in our boat with us. We can have the God of the universe as a person in our boat with us. Jesus is offering to actually step into our boat. Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small. And when we invite Jesus Christ into our boats with us, one of two things will happen. Either he will calm the storm, or the storm will continue to rage as it has for many of us, as it does for many of us. But as the storm rages, he will calm you. He will either calm the storm or he will calm you. All we have to do is respond to that offer of relationship, to step into that relationship with him. For those of us already in that relationship with him, to go deeper in that relationship with him. Thank you so much for giving me a hearing. I look forward to taking your questions. And back to you, Dwayne.
Thank you, Max. I greatly appreciated that talk and your thoughts and just the way you've tied in the gospel. And so thank you so much for that. We're now going to take time for your questions and answers. So thank you for joining us tonight and thank you for your questions. Again, if you've not already done so and you have some questions, we'll take any question, but specifically related to this topic on the economy and where God is in this kind of post-pandemic world. And so if you have some questions, feel free to write them in. But tonight, we're excited to be able to have Daniel Gilman join us to moderate. Daniel is an itinerant speaker for RZIM. He previously served at Canada's Parliament and was a speechwriter for several members of Parliament. combating human trafficking, sexual abuse, and pornography. Daniel has an MA in history from the University of Ottawa. He's married to his best friend, Alexandra. They live in downtown Toronto. I've known Daniel for a few years. It's a delight to have him with us tonight. And so, Daniel, I now turn this over to you.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. It's a delight to partner with you. RZIM Canada has loved working with you in a variety of events with Noetic Shift. And Max, thank you so much for speaking to us from your flat on the other side of the world, across oceans. It was such a delight to get to learn from you tonight. And I am so glad that we can continue on learning from you through questions. So a number of questions have come in, both through the chat here as well as some anonymous questions. The first question I'll ask you comes from Kevin and Sarah. And they asked a question about the marketplace. Knowing that we're dealing with unpredictability, what should business owners focus on and plan for?
It's a great question, a very honest and sensible one. Thank you for the question. I think in a methodological sense, aside from everything I've said about the importance of anchoring ourselves in our identity, in Christ, and looking beyond ourselves, there is the practical reality, right, of running a business. And so I think getting as much advice as you can from as many sources as you can, and seeing what different people are saying is a very helpful way to start. I think, good leadership, including business leadership, is about, getting as much advice as you can from as many people as you can, and then making a decision based on your instincts and your convictions, based on what you know, and then going forward from there. So there is going to be uncertainty. I think the 4 principles that are useful for people, and these are not mine. These I think are pretty widely understood. But the important thing is to make them real for you and to inject some kind of moral fuel into these things, because they can become a little bit sterile and profit-driven. But my suggestion is to take care of these 4 things in this order in relation to your business. Take care of people, take care of supply, take care of demand, and take care of cash. And those are very easy things to say, but you just need to work out what that actually means for you in your business. Take care of people is pretty obvious. It's the people that your business employs. It's the people that your business deals with and works with. It's you, your family. Make sure you're okay. Supply and demand obviously will look different for every single business. I'm not sure if you're a small business, you're in the service sector, you're manufacturing, whatever it might be. But when demand drops at a time like this, which it invariably has, unless you're one of the big 4 tech firms, demand's dropped pretty much for everyone. Or unless you're a church, actually, that's the other sector where demand has gone up. But in terms of transactions, demand has dropped. When demand drops, we can still focus on supply. So I think it's sensible and prudent in a business context to innovate whatever it is that you're actually offering. Think about your USP, whatever your unique selling point is. Work on that, develop that. And this applies to everyone. It doesn't really matter what area of business you're in. A good example is for us at RZIM, we started the process of digital transformation last year. We knew that this sort of time would come. We didn't think it would come this quickly and it would be this important, but we had to deal with how we supply what we do. We try and bring the credibility of the message of Jesus Christ to the questions of culture, and that happened in such a sharp way to shift to the digital platform. And then the nature of our content as well had to shift and prepare itself to channel that same message of Jesus through these new circumstances. And that's our supply chain. I don't want to make it sound too quantitative, but we had to do that. So it doesn't matter how bad demand is, you can still focus on supply. New products, new services, how you deliver them. And then demand obviously is difficult because sometimes it's just not there at the moment. But to court new consumer bases, to think about who you've been working with, to maybe build new relationships and so forth. And then finally to take care of cash. And again, that's much easier to say than to do, but it's the companies and the businesses out there that have liquidity, that have operating buffers in their cash flow and in their cash holdings that have somewhat of a buffer. So I hope that's helpful. Obviously, to place as an overlay to everything I've already said about the need to actually anchor beyond the economic realities.
Absolutely. And Max, as we think about some of the stuff that we have experienced during this time of global pandemic, some of the ways that, as you mentioned, businesses have had to learn to adapt and digitize in order to deliver services. We've also seen a lot of ingenuity come from this time. And tonight is an example of that. Noetic Shift and RZIM being able to partner together. We have Dwayne is speaking to everyone from Hamilton. I'm coming to you from a living room in Toronto, and Max is speaking to us from Singapore. And so that we can see the way that ministries and businesses have been learning to not only adapt in order to do what we used to do, but even reach people further away than we ever have. And I know there's people tuning in tonight from across Canada and as far away as Venezuela. And so
Wow.
Everyone tuning in, you're welcome. But this is a good example of how working together, we're able to learn to do things perhaps even more effectively. And so Max, the next question is along those lines exactly. I'll just read it to you. This comes in anonymously. There's been a lot of ingenuity and learning how to harness digital tech. What are some positive things you think society or businesses have learned from this time that we might carry into the post-COVID world?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think so much positive has come out of this, along with, I think, much more negative, to be clear, to acknowledge the difficulties that people are going through. But I mean, we all probably have stories of things we can identify. I think certainly our responsiveness and agility has changed for those who are thriving in this situation, to actually be rethinking almost every couple of days or every week. What needs to be done now? What's new? How can we innovate? What can we do? Who can we partner with? The Noetic Shift, RZIM partnerships are a perfect example of that. And so one of the great weaknesses of humankind, I talked about the internal brokenness, that our insufficiency to the world. Part of that insufficiency is just the inertia. Human beings love cruise control. We are creatures of comfort. We are creatures of routine. And in a sense, that's not unhealthy when it's about good things and life-giving things in our journeys. But a lot of the time we just stop thinking critically and we stop looking at how we can be doing things better and differently. So in an overarching sense, I think the big takeout that includes tech, and I think digital engagement and tech is obviously the central example of that in COVID-19. But the broader ideal that points to is our capacity and the extent to which we are now able to innovate and be more agile, to be more agile intellectually, to be more agile logistically, to innovate more quickly. Whereas before, organizations, even families, when a new idea came up, they would think on it, there would be a discussion paper, there would be a subcommittee. If you're a Christian on the call, the big get out of jail card is when you're not really sure, you don't want to do something, you just say, I'll go away and pray about it. I'll go away and pray, parachute. Whereas now we've just kind of had to take the bull by the horns a bit more and just get things done and do them quickly. So I think that kind of speed, the appetite for risk now is higher. And I personally don't think enough people take enough risks. I think success in life is to prayerfully take calculated risks. And so I think those are some of the things that are great. And I think digital engagement, just the actual tech, has been great. When you look at how the generations who people just want to see their grandkids, people want to go to church, and the only way to do that has been digitally. So I think that is a helpful thing too.
Thanks so much, Max. So appreciate your insights. Here's the next question. Regarding new workplace skills, what are some things that new graduates, whether from high school or university, should be thinking through and preparing for the new economy?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And I think it comes down to critical thinking and intellectual hunger. So these have always been important things, but you've been able to get away with not doing them for a while, and I think that's gone now. We used to have, in the old economy, people used to be told, if you just go to university and you study law or you study accounting, then you'll come out and you'll be able to practice what you've studied. Now, we've all known for a long time that that's not real, but now you actually can't pretend like you can just learn something and then go and apply it. We need to be constantly learning. We need to be thinking critically about what the world is asking of us and what that actually means. I look at my friends now who continue to practice law, and the law that they are practicing and the way they are practicing it bears almost no resemblance to what we were taught back at university. What we were taught actually is the ability to learn and think analytically and strategically, to break down arguments to their first principles, to construct arguments, to analyze, and so forth. So that's just an example of when you study law, that's what you need to be thinking about, how to think, not necessarily what to think. Everything else changes so quickly that we need to be teachable, we need to be hungry for new knowledge and information, and we need to be learning and listening. constantly. And so for people who say things like, oh, I'm not a reader, or I'm not a book person, well, you don't have to be a book person, but you need to find a way to get new information in. You need to find a way to get new information in. You know, Ravi used to always tell me that to be an exact and informed thinker and worker, you need to read and you need to think. You need to read, you need to write, you need to think. You constantly have to have, he used to say, you need an input of ideas to have an output of productivity. You need to have an input of ideas to have an output of productivity. That doesn't mean you're just lifting stuff from other people, but it means you just have to take things in and digest them and process them. So if that means podcasts, listen to podcasts. If that means books, listen to books. If that means audio books, listen to audio books. If that means talking to people more about what they think, about what's going on in their field and their profession, we all need to become more 360-degree professionals and students, and we need to be constantly learning and hungry for new information. So the whole idea of continuous learning, I think, is the key.
Max, thank you so much. And mentioning what you did, about what Ravi told you, I remember a lot of you watching have known and loved Ravi Zacharias, the founder of the ministry that Max and I work with. I asked him one time, just a couple of years ago, I said, Ravi, like, he's in his 70s and he is always creating new content, coming up with fresh ideas. He's not one of those people whose books are just like rearranged sentences of the same idea. It was always fresh, whether it was Q&A speeches or books he wrote. And so I just asked him, how are you still so excellent at what you're doing? And he said, it's because of what I don't do. He said, I won't waste my time on TV shows and entertainment that kind of drain me. Well, I want to make sure that in my downtime, I'm actually having things pour into me and learning and growing.
Yeah.
And so he said, Daniel, if you want to be like that, you need to read. And so I think that's been words I've actually treasured. I've written down for myself in this time, because there is a lot more flexibility. Even those of us who are working hard from home, there is more flexibility. And especially for those who might find themselves collecting CRB right now, CERB, and not actually be being able to be like at the job they love. And this applies directly to graduates, which this question was about. If you find that you have some time before getting back to work, it can be tempting for us. It can definitely be tempting for me, and my boss is watching, but it can be tempting to spend our time just resting and relaxing, kind of vegging out. And in Ravi's words, which you remind me of, we need to make sure that we're working hard to be reading and learning. And if we do those things, we are going to be better prepared for the post-pandemic economy. So appreciate your reminding of that, Max. Here's the next question from Sadie, and this is the most voted for question tonight. So Max, Sadie's question is, how can we be safe, healthy, without being overcome by fear?
Such an important question, Sadie. Thank you for that, and thank you for those that voted it up too. I'll give you the political advisor and the lawyer's answer. It depends. And then I'll give you a proper, more substantive answer. It's really a question of balance, I think, and of being realistic about who we are, realistic about the world in which we live, and realistic about the difference between our responsibility and our brokenness and the brokenness in the world. So I think it really just comes back to, in the most mature way possible, understanding the reality of what's out there, the fact that it is uncertain, that it is unstable. So fear in that sense doesn't have to be a posture of trepidation, right? So it doesn't have to be fear with a capital F, but we need to be situationally aware, to use another management piece of jargon. Situational awareness drives us to be prepared and ready, whereas fear just kind of drives us to retreat. So there's no need to fear. And that's why I think a relationship with God through the person of Jesus Christ is such a life-changing thing, and it's such a qualitatively unique offering that no other worldview actually gives you, because it takes away, that need to fear. It actually gives you a good logical and experiential reason in our heads and in our hearts why we don't need to fear, because otherwise the command not to fear or just don't be scared, it actually doesn't make sense if you take it to its logical conclusion, unless you have an object of ultimate dependence, like the person of Jesus, that's anchored to something outside of the storm, which is God himself. Unless you have that, saying don't fear doesn't actually make any sense. So first of all, we don't want to fear, we want to be situationally aware, but there is a connector that logical connector needs to take a theological form. And Jesus has given us that, the message of Jesus that we Christians called the gospel. That word gospel just means good news, right? So sorry if you've got Christians in your life that just keep saying gospel and don't explain what it is. We're just really excited because it's good news. The good news is that we don't need to fear. But we still have personal responsibility. In the Bible, it's clear again and again and again that there are two overarching realities. One is that God is sovereign. He's all-powerful. He's in control. It's his sea. He knows about the storm. But we also do have personal responsibility. We have moral agency. We have capacity. As Daniel so perfectly put it earlier, we have great opportunities to be able to read and to learn and instruct ourselves and build ourselves up, knowing that we are not ultimately in control, but to do what we can. There's a point, I think, in one of the Chronicles of Narnia, I think it might be Prince Caspian, where, same old storyline from, most children's books. The bad guys are coming. The White Witch and her army are advancing. And the children are really scared. They're really scared. And Aslan, who's, the great lion, the Christ figure, if you like, of this story, he's nowhere to be seen. He just routinely will kind of pop in and out of the story whenever he feels like it. And Lucy, who's the youngest daughter, she is freaked out. And she's the first one to meet Aslan, and she just continues to scream for Aslan. She said, "We just need Aslan. We just need Aslan." She's crying out for Aslan. She's just calling on Aslan because she knows that once Aslan arrives, everything will be okay. Lucy's right. We should be crying out and calling out to God. We should be crying out to something beyond where we are, because the reality of the situation needs a transcendent actor. It needs transcendent intervention, and God offers us that. And so Lucy is correct to call out for Aslan. But then her brother Peter says something really powerful that I think sums up the answer to this question. Peter says, "Lucy, Aslan will get here when he gets here. In the meantime, he would expect us to do what we can with what we've got. He'll get here when he gets here, but in the meantime, he would expect us to do what we can with what we've got." God is all sovereign. Jesus is reaching out to every single one of us. And when he's in our lives, we can rest assured that he will intervene in the brokenness of the world as and when he deems appropriate. But in the meantime, with him in our lives and in our hearts, we are empowered not to fear and to do what we are called to do with what we've got. And so the way we prepare for this, the way we strengthen our businesses, the way we invest in relationships, the way that we pour out love on people around us who are suffering and are struggling, relationally, financially, however it might be, the way we skill up and reskill ourselves and read the markets and read the economy, the way we plan for university, the way we adjust to learning online and working online, all of that is our responsibility. God doesn't leave us to do it alone. He's still with us. But the brokenness of the world out there, we can know that he has got that. He's a God of redemption. He's a God who is sovereign. He's a God who is all-powerful. He will take care of that. It's his sea. And even though our boats are so small, we can rest assured that we've got him in our boat with us. And none of what I've just said needs to be manifested propositionally alone. It's all manifested relationally. It's all through an up-close and personal relationship with God. This is not an algorithm. These are not theories. These are not systems of living that might help you get through the pandemic. This happens through an up-close and personal relationship with God himself. Thanks so much for the question.
Max, thank you so much for your answer. This next question comes from Cham, and he asks, talking God might not be understood by non-Christians, especially in the marketplace. So how do you explain suffering and God's goodness and love during this suffering period?
The first thing I'd say, first of all, I really want to affirm the question, because it means, Sham, that you are the kind of person who is engaging with non-Christians, that you are wanting to share the truth about what you have found and the reality of who Jesus is in your life. I just really want to encourage that and affirm you in that. I think there are two planks to the answer, and it's really up to each of us to pray through them and to look for opportunities to actualize these two things in our workplaces. The first is to remember that it all depends on relationship. And so what I encourage you to do is to continue to build authentic friendships of trust in your workplace. And don't build them, if you're a Christian, don't build them in order to evangelize your colleagues, right? Don't make friends with non-Christians in order to make them Christian, okay? You just turn them into a project, and people see that coming a mile away. And that actually is not quite what the Bible says. The Bible says, go out there and love people and build authentic relationships of trust with them just for the sake of it. just as an end in itself. We're just called to love our neighbors as we love ourselves as an end in itself. So that is one separate, wholly contained biblical call for all Christians. There's a second one that says, and share me with them. Share the love of Jesus with them. Share the message of Jesus with them. So they're actually separate conceptually, even though they work together relationally. So the first thing I encourage and advise you to do is continue to invest in those relationships. This message of Jesus Christ is a big deal. It's so important, and it speaks to fractures on the human heart that sometimes can cut really deep. So it's a 10-ton gospel that we're talking about. If you try and carry that 10-ton gospel across a 5-ton bridge, it could be difficult. So build that bridge up, strengthen the bridges of your friendships so that when you do get the opportunity to share him, to share your faith, to share what he's done in your life, the bridge is already strong. Now, quick sidebar, I'm not saying that you shouldn't just meet people randomly and share Jesus with them. You should always be willing to do that, whether it's on a train, on a bus, in an elevator, that's fine. But this question was specifically about colleagues at work. So you got to invest, it's got to take time. Good relational evangelism can take between 5 and 50 years. So be prepared for that. Be prepared for that, because good friendships do last for between 5 and 50 years. So take your time, do it relationally. The actual substance of the answer to the question of suffering in particular is because the world's broken and we are broken. That's the reason. And Christianity is the only worldview in town. It's the only worldview in the marketplace of ideas that acknowledges those two things, that the world is broken and we are broken. So I would pitch two aspects of the Christian worldview in a substantive sense to answer the question when you have the opportunity, is to say, well, the reality of suffering actually points to Christianity as worthy of being taken seriously, because we say, the Bible says that the world is broken and human beings are broken, and we see the evidence for that. COVID is evidence for that. Murder is evidence for that. My own heart is evidence for that. But secondly, it provides the most compelling response to suffering in human history. It doesn't just diagnose it, but the cross of Jesus Christ actually brings together perfect love, perfect justice, and perfect mercy in one place in human history as a response to the reality of human suffering. And you don't see that anywhere else. There is no other worldview that offers that. So when Christians are questioned on suffering, we should be really excited, because there is no better question than to demonstrate the uniqueness of the cross and the person and the power of Jesus Christ.
Thanks so much, Max. And Sham, I know that exactly what Max is saying about loving people. One of the things that has helped me be able to bridge the gap sometimes with friends who don't really have a grid for God, don't really think it's funny to believe in God. Perhaps they think I'm praying to an imaginary friend. It's precisely in the context that you're writing the question about, times of suffering, where my friends, or even in some cases my aunts and uncles who are complete atheists, it's in the time of suffering where a text to them saying, hey, I'm praying for you, is the only time that they actually read that text and appreciate it. Sometimes they've surprised me with a text asking for me to pray to a God they don't even believe exists. But in the time of suffering, it's actually helps them see that they're seen, and helps them know that they're heard and that they matter to you. And so I would encourage you, and this is a fresh encouragement to myself, that even if we feel like people might not get the grid that we have for God, to not hesitate to still mention him and be able to witness to the hope we find in our suffering in God. And it calls for vulnerability. And like Max said, we so appreciate the heart of the question, because it shows your heart for people in suffering. Mm-hmm. Well, we're just about out of time, so we'll have one last question, but please everyone stay with us. Dwayne is gonna tell you about a gift that his team is giving away, so please stay with us. He'll come up in just a few moments and he'll share that with you. So you want to stay to the end, especially to hear this question as well. So this will be the last question. And Max, I just want to say again, thank you so much for waking up really early and speaking to us all the way from Singapore. I'll let you close out the night just before Dwayne comes up. But you mentioned earlier on the link between the rate of unemployment and suicide. Really tough stuff to hear, but so real. And so I'm wondering if you can provide some insights on why that is the case and what we as individuals or communities can do about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks again so much for joining us. Always nice to see your face and to partner with you as well. This is such an important question because it gets to the heart of the emotional impact of this pandemic. And I personally, I don't want to sound alarmist, but I think the emotional impact and the mental ill health impact of this pandemic will be greater than the physical impact of it. And I think it'll be lost, a little bit in the data because it will be amortized over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, the impacts of this. I think the reason, my view anyway, is that the reason for the commensurate rises in unemployment and suicide, and there are other indicators too, mental ill health, anxiety, depression, social dislocation, isolation, all kinds of stuff goes up when unemployment goes up. It points back to the 3 points that I tried to make in my talk. And I'll take the unemployment example as an example. When unemployment rises, if you have been trying to build your identity and your anchor has been your job, or your anchor has been your professional advancement or your professional reputation or your capacity to provide materially for a certain standard of living for your family, those are all really good things. But if those things have been your anchor point from which you draw your identity and then that is taken away, then that combined with the myth of independence that society sells you, that it's all about self-actualization and individual building up of self and self-sufficiency, that combined with the suffering that comes as a result of unemployment, very naturally will drive people into despair, because it's not just our jobs that have gone, our entire identity has been threatened and has come crashing down. And that's why when we anchor our identity in the person of Jesus, that can never happen. You actually become immune to the storm. You become immune to anything the storm can throw at you, whether it's unemployment or a relationship breakup, even death itself. You actually become immune even to death itself through the person of Jesus. That's the difference between anchoring outside of the storm and just trying to improve your boat or improve your anchor or polish everything up inside of the storm. It doesn't really matter how hard you hold on to something inside your boat. The boat's still in the storm. Like, you're not stable until you're anchored to land or to the seabed. That's exactly what God offers. And so just to close, I guess, before we throw back to Dwayne, there's a story in the Bible that's told in Jesus's biographies. We have 4 biographies of Jesus in the Bible that are carbon datable, that we have transcripts of, that we can cross-check. And they tell the story of Jesus in a storm, literally in a boat, with some of his disciples. And the disciples are freaking out because the storm is raging and Jesus is asleep in the storm. And they wake him up, and he wakes up and he calms the storm. The great irony of that story, and the main point I think that Jesus is trying to get across, is that the problem wasn't that he was asleep. They thought that he was asleep. The problem wasn't that he was asleep. The problem was that they were asleep to who he was. They were asleep to the reality of who he was. They were asleep to the reality that he was in their boat. And so there are a couple of kinds of people who are on this call, because there are only a couple of kinds of people among us. There are people on this call, there are some of us for whom Jesus is in our boat, but we are not fully awake to the reality of who he is and who he wants to be in our lives, right? And we feel like we've needed to wake him up somehow, and we've been trying to wake him up. But the reality is we have to wake up to who he is. And there are others of us on this call who don't know this Jesus that I've been talking about. They think he's just a nice guy or a good teacher. I just want to assure you that he's much, much more than that. And I encourage you to invite him into your boat. It's the only way that we can be assured that either the storm will be calmed or that we will be calmed amidst the storm. Thanks again, Daniel. God bless you guys.
It's beautiful and true.
I want to thank both Daniel and Max for joining us tonight and for helping us think more clearly about tonight's topic, life in the marketplace post-pandemic. You guys have done an amazing job of just sharing your thoughts and of directing us to the Lord Jesus Christ and him being our ultimate anchor. Tonight, we're giving away a free book for those of you who are not believers. So if you're joining us tonight and you haven't yet crossed a line of faith, or you're a skeptic exploring Christianity, the book is called Where is God in a Coronavirus World by John Lennox. If you're a believer tonight, if you're a Christian, we encourage you to buy the book from Amazon, Indigo, Chapters, and read it, or get the audiobook. This offer is for those of you listening that are skeptical or exploring Christianity. All you need to do is contact us on the noeticshift.org website. So go to noeticshift.org, the contact us page, fill out the form with book in the comment section, and we'd be happy to send you this book and even follow up with you if you'd like with some more questions that you might have. But we'd be delighted to give this book to anyone who's exploring Christianity as a gift. For those of you who've joined to watch and participate tonight, we invite you to join us next week for our last week in this series. Dr. Michael Haykin, professor of church history at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, will be with us. He'll be speaking on the topic Christian response to historic pandemics, and also talking a bit about the way that pandemics have changed our world. So please invite others to join for this very important series on where is God in the coronavirus. And on behalf of both Noetic Shift and RZIM, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. God bless and have a good evening. Thank you.